Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the first day of Higher Education Knowledge in a Plural World. I hope you've had a good lunch break. My name is David Mills, and as a proud SOAS alumni, it's a huge pleasure to be able to introduce Adam Habib, the current director of SOAS, to give the second keynote of our conference. Now, not many of us can claim without hubris to be at once an accomplished researcher, a political activist, an academic leader, and a public intellectual. But I think Adam has shown this is indeed possible. And he's drawn these different sources of expertise together to really reshape debates about the future of higher education. He's a professor of political science. He's had over 30 years of academic research and administration experience, spanning 5 universities and many different institutional contexts. He always focuses on the importance of ideas, translating them into action, building institutions. He was for 8 years Vice Chancellor at WITS, currently Director, as I say, of SOAS, former chair of University of South Africa, and he helped initiate a really important African research network called ARUA, African Research Universities Alliance. If you read one thing of his, read Rebels and Rage, reflecting on Fees Must Fall. It's a powerful story of how he led WITS's response to these really important student protests and how they changed the debates around student finance in South Africa. Today, I know he won't shy away from telling us things as they are. He's going to provoke us. It's going to be about how we need to reinvent universities and how we need a methodology of global partnership that's rooted in institutions and really rethinking how we think about our global higher education system. Adam, Reinventing Higher Education for an Inclusive World. The field is yours, please.
Thank you, David. Colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin where I think David ended, which is firstly by thanking Simon, David, and the colleagues at the Center for Global Higher Education for inviting me to share my thoughts on higher education knowledge for a plural world. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a real pleasure to have, to be able to share my thoughts on the issues at hand. I should also kick off with an apology. An apology because I'm going to be frank and bold right from the outset. And I know we are meant to be frank and bold in the academy, and we pride ourselves on being frank and bold. But as you very well know, this isn't always the case. We are often so diplomatic, so ambiguous, that we aren't able to get to the core matters at hand. And so I really am going to be frank and bold, and I don't really do this as a sign of discourtesy. It really is as a means to be very clear on how I see issues, how I think what are the essential challenges that we confront as a human community, as a global higher education system, and what are the potential solutions for those challenges. I want to make clear, I don't have easy answers to these questions. What I am asking for is an honest recognition of the challenges. What I'm asking for is a willingness to explore and experiment and engage in iterative experimentation so that we learn by doing, and in the process rebuild and reinvent higher education so that it's more appropriate for the historical challenges of our time. You see, colleagues, we live in interesting but dangerous times. Our world today is as unequal as it was before World Wars I and II. We are increasingly becoming as socially and politically polarized as we were then. Right-wing, populist and nativist parties stalk all of our lives, deepening divides among our communities, both nationally and internationally. Political and economic elites are paralyzed about what to do, or have been unable to marshal the political will to undertake what needs to be done. And yet, what needs to be done is known. At the heart of our crisis today is the lack of social justice. We have taken millions out of poverty, but millions remain mired in misery still. As important, if not more threatening to our collective future, is inequality. So many have so little because so few have too much. This is the popular realization of our time. And it is why globalization has come under attack. Populist and nativist parties have been able to mobilize on the foundation of this resentment. But they, of course, have no answers as they propel us into a retreat into nativism and chauvinism of all kinds. The net effect has been a deepening of divides within and between nations, which imperils the human community. Climate change, public health, energy, inequality, and social and political polarization are the transnational challenges that require us to cohere and act as one. Only if we build the bridges of human solidarity will we survive as a human species. This is the central lesson emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic, which brings the principle of social justice to the heart of the global conversation. By doing so, it creates the possibility, only a possibility, of enabling conditions for building one of the platforms for human solidarity that is so necessary in our world. But this is not inevitable. Indeed, the pandemic has demonstrated both our collective strength and our central weakness. Our strength lies in our ingenuity, reflected in the scientific and technological revolution underway, which has enabled the development of multiple vaccines in an unprecedented short time frame. Yet COVID-19 also revealed our central human weakness, manifested in the crude "we are first" response that enabled a nationalism in the procurement and deployment of vaccines. This had occurred despite the repeated advice of the World Health Organization and individual public health specialists that the key to bringing this pandemic under control is an equitable deployment of vaccines around the world. They said, if some countries remain mired in the pandemic, none in our world are safe. We either defeat this virus collectively, or we succumb to its devastating social and its economic consequences. How to do this is one of the defining questions of our time. It is as relevant to higher education as other parts of human existence. You see, there is an important scientific rationale for acting collectively, reflected in the work of Tanya Douglas, the chair in biomedical engineering and innovation at the University of Cape Town, who died in March 2021. In her TED Talk, "To Design Better Tech, Understand Context," she lamented the deployment of inappropriate technologies from the industrialized to the developing world. Prof. Douglas's work pointed to the need to think of innovation as contextually relevant. Understanding context required, she said, an understanding of the social, political, and economic features of a society. It highlighted the need for this interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity work and the importance of considering the challenges of marginalized groups whose interests and concerns are often ignored. Only then, she maintained, can we sustainably address our transnational challenges and advance a socially just world. Formulating and or adapting technologies to the contextual circumstances of the developing world is a responsibility for all of us, but it truly needs to be led by the institutions of the South. This is only one part of the challenge, which also requires establishing the institutional infrastructure and developing the enabling human resource capabilities across the world. We need more inventors, technologists, social actors, academics, and students. In short, innovators. For this to happen, we need enabling environments. We need adequately resourced and academically excellent universities and vocational colleges that train, research, and innovate. We need companies that are entrepreneurial. We need incubators that can nurture new technologies. And we need venture capital networks that can sponsor these initiatives. At one level, we recognize this. Our policies in the developed and developing world speak of the importance of inclusive, equitable, and quality education. Yet we behave institutionally in a manner that deepens inequalities and institutional divides. Global partnerships, scholarships, and mobility across the world have been features of the globalization era. Yet the brain drain not only persists, but has escalated dramatically, weakening institutions in many parts of the developing world. This dynamic is not the only causal factor in the weakening of institutions in the developing world, and in particularly the African continent. In the African continent, they were irreparably damaged by structural adjustment policies in the 1980s, when international development agencies called for the prioritization of primary and secondary education, resulting in the underfunding of universities. The idea was that tertiary education would be located in the developed world. This policy was partially reversed in subsequent decades, but the damage had been done. Our global partnership model has not fundamentally changed since the 1980s and rests on direct scholarships to talented individuals in the developing world to acquire tertiary education in Europe, North America, the UK, and now even Beijing and China. The assumption is that these students will return home. But the evidence of the last few decades is that this is not the case. When students move, life happens. They fall in love, they have families, they get jobs, and they stay in the global north. At a conference on the African diaspora, which I attended at the African Union in Addis Ababa in 2019, Abdoulaye Goye demonstrated that more than 80% of students do not return. He did the calculations and based on much of the developing world, but particularly on India and China. China, more than 80% of students from India do not return when they leave. China has reversed the trend only recently, since 2007. And I have no idea what recent developments over the last 2 years are likely to portend. It is only Singapore that has been the exception to the trend in the global south. In any case, the corollary in the developing world is that institutions have been weakened. Human resource capabilities are not developed, and inclusive development has been compromised. Some among us speak of brain circulation rather than brain drain, and the importance of remittances to the developing world. But if we are honest, we would recognize that these are weak counter trends that do not fundamentally change the negative institutional and structural dynamics that accompany the brain drain. I must stress that this is not only a problem for the developing world. It is as much a problem for the developed world. As human resource capacities decline in the developing world, so do the ability to deal with structural challenges of our era. All of our challenges, I said, are transnational in character: climate change, inequality, public health, and the social and political polarization have global consequences. We need the institutional infrastructure and human resources in both the developed and the developing world to stem such challenges at their source, wherever they emerge. Yet, our global partnership methodologies undermine this in practice, if not in intent. I am not advocating for some autarkic retreat into nationalism, nationhood, and ethnicity. I do not believe this is possible. And I am of the view that the human spirit has simultaneously an impulse to wander, to explore, to globalize, if you might, and to identify and familiarize, to localize. These are not mutually exclusive agendas, as populist and nativist parties tend to suggest. We can love our families and our community networks and still practice human solidarity. It is possible to be both local and global. Indeed, it is essential to our survival as a human species. I am advocating, and many of my colleagues are, a new methodology of global partnership, one that is more rooted in institutions than individuals. In higher education, it would require joint teaching programs, co-curriculation, and split-site scholarships that enable students to gain scientific knowledge, develop a global consciousness, have access to new equipment and funding networks, and yet still be sufficiently rooted in institutions of the developing world to allow for this knowledge and skills to be applied in local contexts. It will require co-financing and co-ownership of research centers and institutes between multiple universities in the North and South. Such a methodology would also allow students from the developed world to have the opportunity to visit and understand the context of the developing world and to develop skills and knowledge that are more universally applicable. But this, let's be honest, goes against the grain of the strategic plan of some universities in the developed world. Some of the more high-ranking institutions believe their brands will be diluted by the joint teaching addendas, and their mission would be compromised, their mission to train the scientists and knowledge brokers of our world. But these institutions have not realized that whatever their scientific strengths, however recognized their academic cohort may be, however talented their students are, their contributions are limited. In their legitimate desire to be competitive, they undermine their own mission. They have forgotten that great science needs to be accompanied by contextual understanding to have a significant global impact. The economic elites in these institutions need an understanding of the context of the developing world. This is only possible through global teams of researchers and institutions coming together, deploying collective knowledge, skill sets and understanding to develop contextually relevant technologies and solutions to the challenges of our time. We need an equitable global partnership of institutions that are rooted in the diversity of the human community and deployed across all our countries. This is a global agenda that is more equitable, socially just, sustainable, and universally relevant for this era. It is an agenda, I want to add, that is not possible under the business models that underpin higher education in the Anglo-Saxon world, enmeshed as it is within the politics and character of particular nation states. Some of the strongest higher education systems are premised on a business model in which foreign students, mainly from the developing world, are cross-subsidizing the costs of training for domestic students. This model, I want to add, is not only unsustainable, but further engenders and consolidates the institutional and societal inequalities that erode collective global capacities to address universal challenges. Higher education and the business models that underpin it must be fundamentally reimagined if they are to rise to our current challenges. This requires a political magnanimity and social solidarity of nation states, political classes, and economic elites that has not always been forthcoming. Yet even in this moment, there are seedlings of hope. Partnership between the African Research Universities Alliance, a network of research universities on the African continent, the UKRI, I might add, for a period of time, 2-3 years ago, and the Guild of European Research Universities have been built. And an engagement and advocacy effort was undertaken with the European Union and the African Union. This initiative culminated in February 14th, 2022, when the African and European Unions announced an AU and EU innovation agenda, which had as its core mandate the strengthening of African research capacity. The announcement, I might add, was quickly followed by a statement from the African Research Universities Alliance and the Guild of European Universities, expressing support for the agenda, and in particular, for the training and strengthening of clusters of excellence, the strengthening of world-class research and innovation infrastructures, and the promotion of joint African-European masters and doctoral degree programs. It is rare for there to be such a quick transcontinental university affirmation and support for a development partnership between two regional political unions. And yet there was in this case. Why? It is perfectly understandable, given the fact that the initiative is a game changer and likely to transform the developmental space in significant ways. First, it is a long-term investment in addressing the structural inequalities in the global academy. Second, it fundamentally rewrites the rules of global university partnerships, directing these to institutional cooperation and collaboration, while simultaneously addressing the resource inequities that bedevil such partnerships. Third, it explicitly advocates for the development of joint cross-continental teaching and learning on the grounds that this could assist in stemming the brain drain and enable scientific technological capacity to remain on the African continent. And finally, it enables the interaction between global and local knowledge systems, thereby allowing for the adaptation of global solutions to local context. This is what it means to suggest that science should have no boundaries. It should be a continuous process of engagement between theory and application, between the universal and the local. This is the point which was so powerfully made by Tanya Douglas, who insisted in a TED Talk on the importance of context in the design of biomedical technologies for the developing world. These measures are also fundamentally important, for they speak to the greatest historical challenge of our time: how to develop institutional capacities and build human capabilities across the world to address our transnational challenges. Make no mistake, this is not charity. It is critical to our collective survival as a human species. I say again, all of our challenges, pandemics, climate change, inequality, social and political polarization, extend beyond national borders and require global solutions. Without this, none of us are safe. As a human community, we must learn to swim together or we will collectively sink as planetary destruction or some other crisis results in the extinction of the human species. The EU Innovation Partnership on Research and Teaching starts us off on a path to avoid this outcome. In the process, it will challenge all the existing models of international education. It will challenge the Anglo-Saxon model, which emphasizes the recruitment and training of students from across the world so that they come to universities in the UK, the United States, and Australia. This model is focused on the individual. It accelerates the brain drain and inevitably weakens institutional capacities in the South, sorry. It weakens institutional capacities in the South. The irony, and I know I'm going to say this and I'm going to ruffle feathers, so forgive me for this. The irony is that it is done by public universities in the North, whose documents are often peppered with commitments to global solidarity and social inclusion of the poor and the marginalized. Their academics are often the leading liberal and progressive intellectuals of their societies. Yet these institutions and these individuals pursue business models which are designed by governments to earn foreign currency and increase local GDP, but which drive global inequalities and socially polarize our world. The EU innovation agenda also challenges the benevolent, market-driven model of private and public universities in the North, who offer online university education at a lower cost to poor and middle-class students in the developing world. This was first enabled by the digital technologies and that subsequently accelerated by the pandemic, which pushed all our universities into emergency remote learning. Private companies and public universities who offer this type of online education are glossing over three fundamental realities. First, they assume that learning only happens in the classroom, in this case, the virtual one. But anyone familiar with the universities would know that students learn as much outside the classroom as they learn within it. They learn from the social interactions that universities enable across identity divides and from the plurality of perspectives and values. Second, these institutions ignore that however strong their academics may be, that a curriculum remains the poorer for its lack of local knowledge. Context matters, and a model of higher education in which institutions in the North develop curriculums which they deliver to learners in the South is not only patronizing, colleagues, it is also pedagogically questionable. And third, and finally, this benevolent, market-driven online learning agenda again bypasses local universities. It again weakens their capacities and further compromises our collective ability to address the local manifestation of transnational challenges. The EU innovation agenda advances international education development on a revolutionary assumption. It says it is possible to develop equitable partnerships in an unequal world. This will require solidarity and humility from institutions in the North. But it should also be premised on the principle of financial sustainability. These partnerships cannot always be underwritten by the EU or by private foundations. They require income streams to be developed and an investment from African governments and other governments in the developing world who need to recognize that one can only be truly free when one develops the political will to begin to finance one's own initiatives. These partnerships, in Africa anyway, also require a continental platform, not only because this is the only way Africa's limited number of universities can have the scale of training required for developmental impact, but also because it would mitigate against the curriculum retreating into a national parochialism that sometimes animates the political discourse in many of our societies. The EU innovation agenda is truly groundbreaking. Political elites in the UK, US, and Australia, and even those in China and Russia would do well, to take heed of the developmental philosophy that underlies this plan. They should also recognize that slogans like going global cannot remain rhetorical instruments trotted out at international summits. They require practical implementation. The Europeans and Africans have led on this at their recent summit. Let's hope that other political elites will have the maturity and courage to do the same. You see, colleagues, this is the challenge that confronts us in the UK and in the broader Anglo-Saxon world where I currently am. And I must say that the recent debates, the recent public debates in the UK, does not inspire me with confidence. Take, for instance, HEPI's recent report on international students, developed by London Economics, and which was received with much fanfare in universities UK in September, October last year, and in the broader public. The report suggested that 496,000 international students benefit the UK to the tune of £28.8 billion. Moreover, the benefits, the report suggested, are broadly spread, adding millions to local economies, including £290 million to Sheffield Central, £181 million to Cardiff Central, and £171 million to Glasgow Central. There's much of value in the report. It is an important corrective to some of the hostility in the UK around international students and their national value, providing evidence that international students are not only a cost, but also a benefit to the UK. But should we not be concerned about the narrow commercial and nationalistic approach to the framing of the report and much of the government's plans around international education? This masks the fact that the way we are going about international education has some serious challenges. Again, accelerating the brain drain and weakening institutional capacity and human capabilities in the developing world. The long-term consequences of this are dangerous for the world because we're moving into a historical moment where our biggest challenges are increasingly transnational and will require global solutions. If we are to address these global solutions, we are going to need institutional capacity and human capabilities around the world, which will require rethinking our global partnerships in higher education. And yet, there isn't much of this debate in the UK. You know, much of what I've just said here, I said at the UUK conference with vice chancellors in September last year. It received, 5 minutes of discussion, and we can't quickly moved on because it was too difficult. It raised uneasy questions and it complicated issues. And so in the desire to avoid the complications, we decided to move on. You see, the UUK conference in 2021 correctly celebrated the strength of UK universities and their response to the pandemic. Well deserved. But it also revealed that there is an urgent need for a deeper deliberation on the internationalization of higher education and how UK universities could collectively respond to the collective challenges of our time. This requires a greater appreciation of the tension between our short-term need, mine included, my institutions included, to build financially sustainable institutions, and our long-term desire to be part of a global academy that is capable of responding to the global challenges of our time. Essentially, we require a deeper, a more nuanced conversation than we are currently having. Otherwise, and I'm serious about this, we are currently behaving in a manner in the short term that will destroy our collective global future. And that's the challenge that confronts the UK higher education system. I am sorry to conclude on an ominous note. For centuries, we, particularly in Europe, particularly in the UK, for centuries, we've pretended that science has no boundaries. Yet, every day, we establish institutional and national boundaries that constrain science, that constrain knowledge, and that constrain innovation. We need to break down these boundaries. We need to borrow and learn from each other in a collaborative and equal manner. Lessons learned and innovations developed in particular contexts could lead to challenges, could lead to challenges and to addressing challenges in the rest of the world. What we need is a global academy of commons. This is what needs to be built so that we collectively understand how innovation can play a part in creating a more inclusive world. This is more necessary than ever before. As indicated, all of our challenges are transnational in character. Addressing these transnational challenges of our time, of which COVID-19 is only the most current manifestation, will provide a social and political foundation for us to survive as a global community. It is a bridge of hope between an unequal and fractured past and present and an inclusive collective future, for which we need enabling deliberative arenas. We need to have the courage to ask the hard questions about our practices and improve them where we can. We have the intellectual resources across disciplines and institutions that can assist us in thinking through innovation more carefully to ensure that it is contextually grounded and inclusive. By doing so, we will genuinely address the inequalities and challenges of our time, and through this, create a more socially inclusive and humane world. But none of this is going to happen unless we have the courage as a system, as universities, as institutions, and as individual academics to acknowledge the systemic problems we confront and have an honest conversation about how to resolve them. Are we truly ready for this? Because my last 18 months in the UK suggest this is not happening. Thank you very, very much.
Wow. Alan, that was amazing. Thank you very much. You promised us that you'd be blunt and frank, and you absolutely were. You posed some difficult questions, and it's only when you ask these questions that you realize, why aren't other people asking these questions? Why haven't we been asking these for a long time? Why haven't we been confronting the continuing coloniality of scholarship networks, of international student migration, of even the PhD itself and the mobility it encourages? So you've given us some great thoughts, and we've got some questions streaming in. Please do ask some, chime in the chat. I'm going to start, Adam, just by responding to what you've presented with us. And just a couple of thoughts about this vision, which I think is, a really ambitious, brave vision for a sort of global solidarity, a new way of thinking about partnership. Would you want to comment at all on what's in it for the EU? I mean, you presented as a movement of solidarity. Of course, there's a whole geopolitics to this as well. The European Union has always been a political project. And it has done very well using higher education to build its political agendas. So perhaps a little reflection on why they are suddenly doing this in a way that seems to me to happen just after China seems to be doing it very well. So perhaps a comment on that. And then I guess the other question is the technicalities of some of this. Currently, African higher education systems are so hamstrung because their governments are putting so little money into R&D. We haven't got the infrastructures in the systems. Often there aren't research and development strategies. How can African governments create a solidarity of equals in their negotiations with an EU funder when often they haven't got the sort of technical capacities and the administrative infrastructures they might need to be able to do that sort of negotiation well? There, a couple of questions.
Well, I think that's both are really interesting questions, David. And so I'm going to be honest. I said to you, I will be bold and honest, and I'm going to answer as honestly as I can. I think that the European Union, by the way, I should start by saying, this shouldn't be a question that is being raised by a Vice Chancellor or a Director of SOAS. And it shouldn't be a question that is only being raised by a number of academics or the African Research Universities Alliance. I don't understand why UNESCO is not raising it. I don't know why this is not the leading debate that is coming out of the World Bank or the United Nations or the many of the international development agencies that claim to truly represent the world. And so I think that we should be asking, why aren't the institutions with the mandate to be representing the world not raising these issues as they should be? The second thing I want to say is that on the EU, why they're doing it? Well, it seems to be that there are three reasons why. The first is the competitive dynamic. There's China emerging. China is having an extensive footprint in the African continent. It's having enormous implications for the competitive economic dynamic of the EU. And they're beginning to start ask questions on how do we develop and respond to China and some of the other institutions. Second, let's be honest, there's a migration agenda in the middle of Europe. There's people strolling across the Mediterranean, and suddenly the Europeans have kind of recognized having warships in the Mediterranean doesn't stop this. They're coming whether you like it or not. And you've got to kind of figure out what is the developmental dynamic that is going to enable us. And partly that's going to require getting economic development on the table. And as you talk about economic development, you talk about inclusive development trajectories, you start talking about institutional capacities, you talk about human resource capabilities. And so these are becoming agendas for the European Union in a way that they haven't been for a long period of time. So there's a competitive dynamic. There is, if you like, a domestic dynamic. And then there's a third, kind of what I call old-fashioned lobbying by the African Union, by the ARUA, the African Research Universities Alliance, with the Guild of European Universities. I recall having a conversation 2 years ago, sitting with vice chancellors in the middle of Europe, trying to plot how we're going to get the European Union to start taking this seriously. I require how sitting with vice chancellors from the African continent, how to manage an irate African Union when we're saying, don't give the governments money, ring fence the money for higher education and EU partnerships. And many, many African politicians were irritated And how would we manage irritated African politicians around this? Old-fashioned lobbying has its role. And so, in a sense, I don't think the EU just suddenly woke up one morning on February said, we're now feeling socially inclusive, and we think that that's the future. I also think, to be honest, the pandemic has shaken the world. I think the pandemic has shown that we better learn to live together. We better figure out a way on how we align national and global in useful ways. The African Union, I think that there are 3 lessons to be learned from the African side. And I say this openly as somebody who comes from the continent. The first is, I think, in part, we're going to have to push our governments. I wish I didn't have to say this, but we're going to have to push our governments to a development agenda. And there's nothing that makes bloody politicians think when money is put on the table. So I'll give you the example of how South Africa's developmental agenda emerged. And really it emerged in part from Sweden. Sweden had for long provided support for South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement, and then in the initial years for the post-apartheid government. And after a while, I think after 10 or 12 years, it said, look, we've got to pull out. There's money needed in more. This is a middle income country. Where else can we do this? But what it said is, instead of taking out our money, we'll keep the money in if South Africa will put some money into the pot that will become official development assistance from South Africa to the rest of the continent. And so South Africa's ODA was born by European governments putting money and saying, here's some money, would you match it? And let's take it out forward. Now, I think that European Union, the European community could do something like that. Just put some money on the table. We want to develop, but you guys put some money on the table. We'd like you to start thinking through how we do this. So that's the first. The second is, I'd like some foundations, the SOAS Foundation, the Gates Foundation. Instead of thinking you got the answers to the world's development challenges, how about coming together and saying, we want to drive these transnational partnerships. We'll put some money on the table if the African Union or African governments make a matching contribution. And so you force the politicians, you drag them screaming to the developmental agenda that they claim they collectively believe in. And then thirdly, colleagues, there's a level of pragmatism. We have to recognize, people say to me, when I was in Wits University, people said to me, well, we shouldn't be talking about research-intensive universities in Africa. We should talk about equal universities across the continent. And I said to them, why is it okay for you in Europe to talk about research-intensive universities, but it's not appropriate for Africa to talk about research-intensive universities? I think developmental agendas require diverse higher education systems, research-intensive institutions, comprehensives, vocational colleges, like exists in Europe, like exists in the United States, like exists in China. And what we need is networks to be built between these various parts of the higher education system, but between them and their counterparts in other parts of the world. That's the developmental agenda. Choice, a level of pragmatism, a level of agenda and eye to the social justice goals. I think it's a combination of both. I say to my colleagues in SOAS, you want to be progressive, it's not how much you quote Marx or Lenin or Trotsky. It's about how you behave differently in a way that makes a difference in addressing global inequalities. That's what I think needs to happen. And that's what I'm urging our colleagues in the room to start thinking about.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so you're giving us lots there, but there's lots more we can take from the audience as well. I'm going to ask perhaps if we can take 3 questions, and then you can respond to those and then see how we get on. So can we start with Pete, with Christina Yanzang, and with Olga Mun? Pete, do you want to come in first?
Yes, here I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Well, wonderful speech. And I was really struck by the idea of the historical moment that we're at. And this is a question about privatization and the privatization metaphor, if you like. Of course, it's a reality as well. You know, privatizing what seemed to be natural monopolies, such as, you know, gas or the railways or whatever at certain times, with technological changes and different social changes at certain points of time, you know, 40 years ago or whatever, often made sense. And I'm often interested in the analogy between privatizing what seemed to be natural monopolies and trying to work out how to expand access to education when you have limited public resources. And why do you have limited public resources? Well, part of it's because of global inequality, and part of it is because you have a state that the local population doesn't trust enough to pay taxes to. Would you be able to comment on that? You know, is privatization the right word for trying to create more education, including through fees and charging people who can pay and so on?
Yeah.
Good. That's great. Thank you, Pete. Christina?
Thank you. Hi, Adam. Thank you so much for this speech. I'm so inspired. And you mentioned many times about the role on technology and how that can be applied to build a more inclusive society in general. And nowadays, we have a lot of discussion about the metaverse, and especially PwC has released a report basically looking at the metaverse, you know, like impact. It will start from 150 billion US dollars last year to about 1.5 trillion US dollars in the next 10 years. And we see all the big tech companies, they're providing enterprise solutions to try to support this like major, you know, technological scale up worldwide. So universities are also looking at how to use metaverse to innovate teaching, research, and enterprise. So I'm very struck by your idea to have this cross-continent global collaboration, you know, framework to champion EDI agenda in general. But how could we use the next biggest thing, say metaverse or AI or VR, whatever it might be, to really support this kind of global higher education collaboration for this inclusive world? Thank you.
Great, Christina, thank you. And finally in this group of questions, Olga Mann.
Thank you so much for the inspiring talk. I have a quick question about the existing initiatives in the UK to rethink and build an alternative vision of higher education, specifically led by, for example, academics. So I think you have highlighted that, you know, the commercialization of higher education is a big problem. Many of the higher education scholars know that, but what can we do about it? So instead of thinking that, you know, somebody in the global south might take a lead on this, if you think about it, the existing system was not necessarily built by the institutions in the global south, that they somehow fit into the existing puzzle. So from my opinion, it's for example, UK universities have a big role and responsibility in reshaping the way it is being funded, specifically in relation to the international students. So what initiative exists to develop, for example, an alternative funding scheme led by UK academics? And how can we, and if, for example, I know that there is research that sort of shows us the alternative ways, but there's no uptake of that research. So how can we really build systems that would actually, you know, have room for voices to be heard? Even, let's say, in our own departments, there is critical research, but there is no mechanisms to act on this research. So this research is then somehow evaporates, right? So there is research on inequality, but there is no uptake on that research. So how can we build those systems of uptake of our own research in the UK higher education system? So I hope my question is clear, but thank you so much for your talk.
Great, thank you. Madam.
So 3 quick questions. I mean, on the privatization of higher education, look, I don't believe the privatization is going to be on its own a solution to the challenges that we confront. Let's be honest. So here's where I do think, as I grappled with the challenges of managing higher education in other parts of the world in the UK, I've tried to become more pragmatic. I don't think being socially just and being pragmatic are mutually exclusive. I think you can bring them together. But here's the problem. What I fear is a group of private companies and public universities, I might add, who think we're going to resolve the challenge of the developing world by creating online education for them. And we create a new inequality. Rich people get face-to-face education and poor people get a virtual relationship. And I think that there's a real challenge with that. And I think that the privatization, and by the way, it's not private companies, you'll see a couple of public universities as responsible for this, as some private companies are. So I don't think that the answer is going to be a privatization model. I do think that somehow we can regulate, we can marshal both resources in the private sector and the public sector. The public sector in the way they commit to that agenda, in the private sector through some regulatory marshalling of this. And we've seen much of this done through developmental models in Southeast Asia in an earlier period. You could harness private resource capacities to do all kinds of things. And we can begin to see how we marshal the resources towards this agenda. Ultimately, I think you're asking a bigger question. How does a fee structure enable this? Or are we looking at a fundamentally new business model? My answer is a fee structure on its own is not going to do this. But I do think how we evolve out of a fee structure is the real tricky thing. And I do think we got to confront the big challenge. You know, everybody uses in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and everybody was given the opportunity to study in higher education for free. We forget that higher education was for a very small proportion of the population. And the developmental challenge of this business model is how do we migrate to a far wider array of people having access to higher education and yet structure it in a way that provides public resources. And part of it is going to be about how we structure these resources. Part of it is by dealing with the challenge of trust and the lack of public trust in politicians and government. And part of it, I gave the example in the South African context of starting from a free model and dedicating a portion of economic development to freeing up a different component of the higher education system over a 10 to 15 year cycle. And I think there's a set of strategic debates about how we could do this in different contexts that are worthwhile having. Christina, on technology, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is where the historical moment is. We have two things that have emerged. On the one hand, our challenges have gone global, which makes it necessary for us to go transact. And for the first time, the global technologies are emerging that allow us to act more imaginatively, that allow somebody to experience a blended learning in its real sense. Some of it is online, some of it is face-to-face, some of it is immersed in VR and other kinds of technologies that are emerging. And there's a whole series of big technological companies that are going really out of their way to build the technologies because they see their next set of billions coming from that. You know what I would love at a global level? Why don't we tax them and say, we're creating a global tax for these companies that will go into using that tax in higher education to assist in creating a more inclusive higher education system on a global playing field. We do taxes on airlines. We do taxes on uranium. Why the hell don't we do taxes on new technologies, new digital technologies? Because they're going to make money on it. So let's develop a partnership that says, let's bring you to experiment on these technologies in our public institutions, but you're going to pay for that. You're going to pay for that by enabling inclusion, by allowing new models of learning, and by hopefully supporting students that can't afford to from marginalized communities, both in the North and from the developing world. So I think there's a much more imaginative public policy agenda that is possible. And this is why I'd like conversations with governments, but I'd particularly like UNESCO and UN agencies to be talking about this kind of stuff. That's where we start pushing the boundaries of the conversation. And then finally, Olga, thank you for this question. I was waiting for it. I was really hoping that you would ask this. And forgive me, because I'm going to say a little bit about SOAS. And I don't mean this as a public relations stunt. I want to tell you how we're grappling with this challenge in SOAS. And then I want to put two challenges out there. So we adopted at SOAS a new strategic plan 9 months ago. And at the heart of the strategic plan is a new form of equitable partnership. We said not the student mobility partnerships that we have that exist, the normal partnerships, but fundamentally a model of partnership that is co-curriculated, that is co-taught, and that is co-credentialed. And we've asked each of our departments to start exploring one such partnership with an institution or institutions in the South that can develop that kind of model, preferably on something that speaks to a global challenge around the Sustainable Development Goals. And so let's say you're doing, how do you manage pandemics in Islamic societies of West Africa? How would you manage Ebola? And you can't manage Ebola by simply looking at vaccines. You have to imagine it by how you would imagine burial practices in Islamic societies in West Africa. And so in a sense, that's the first way to do it, is how do we, and so we're pushing the boundaries of saying, now, the reason we can get away with it, I would say, is because we're an institution which has at its mandate Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. So I'm saying, let's live and breathe this. Go and have partnerships with real partnerships with institutions in Africa. And don't tell me you can't co-credential because you're worried about quality assurance. Make it up. And the great thing about being a director and a higher education executive, you can change the rules. Let's change the rules, provided it complies with the law and with the national system. So that's the first. We have also asked them, let's ask how we can make a new fee structure and how we would structure the fees in a way that is both tenable, etc. So that's the first. The second, and here's the two challenges that I want to put on the table. One is for donors. It's great that donors could marshal universities to do things. There's nothing that vice chancellors like more than is money. If you want vice chancellors to go in an inclusive direction, you can't rely on them. Get the donors to change the agenda and put the money there, and you watch how many vice chancellors run there. That's the second. And the third, a challenge to you as academics, Olga. Why isn't the UCU, the National Trade Union Federation of Academics, raising these issues? Why isn't the National Union of Students raising transcontinent? They do critique. They talk about the corporatization of university, but why don't they bring their academics together and say, how do we find an alternative agenda? Ask your unions that, because only when we get social movements to start taking this seriously does this become less of a rhetoric and more of a real inclusive agenda. And that's the challenge I put to us all. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, there's so many things we could say at this point. And anyone with union membership, of course, will be immediately on the phone to their union rep, saying what really matters here. Adam, I'm really sorry, but you've given us so much, but unfortunately, time doesn't give as much. There've been some great questions in the chat about how we really make brain circulation work, about how we think about working with African elite institutions, about online education, which you've already addressed. We're going to have to wrap that up for today. We've been very lucky to have you. You have left us with a huge agenda. These are things that weren't talked about enough at the UNESCO conference in Barcelona last week, but they're on the agenda at the CGHE conference. And I'm sure we will make sure they stay on our agenda, because the researchers in this community here really care about all of this stuff. And hopefully we can make some progress on some of these agenda items. Adam, thank you very much again for all of us. We really appreciate your support, and a virtual, if silent, round of applause from us all. It's now time for a break, everyone. We have 15 minutes before the next session begins at 3:10. So thank you all again for your time, for coming.